Hi everyone, I wanted to do another video in this series I'm calling Barely-Vangelical, covering the different dimensions of my personal faith and spiritual journey, especially exploring ideas and doctrines. And so my first video was on atonement, and you can watch that if you haven't seen that yet. With each video, what I want to do is I want to focus on a specific area of Christian thought or Christian belief, and then kind of track my journey through three phases. My inheritance, or what I received growing up, as it relates to that idea, my phase of questioning it or deconstructing it or interrogating it, which is usually probably where I'll spend the most time in each of these videos, is just pulling out what are the things that started to kind of cause tensions for me. And then move into a third phase of how did I reconstruct, or kind of what reorder did I bring after a period of disorder, or kind of where have I landed, such as it is on each of these areas. So inheritance, questioning, second naivete, or order, disorder, reorder, or however you want to phrase that. Those three phases are what I want to track on each topic. And today I want to record a video on hell, a video on my journey through the doctrine related to hell and the afterlife in Christianity, because it's been quite a journey, and there seemed to be some interest in this based on the video I did of the recent book Holy Hell. That got a lot of interest, so I thought maybe it'd be good to do a video talking about kind of my personal journey on it, and I'll mention books along the way that have helped me, resources that have helped me, as it maybe will be helpful to you, but I hope that you can relate to some of what I am about to share here. So let's dive in. So the first phase, my inheritance. I grew up in, if you've followed me on this channel for some time, then none of this will surprise you. I've alluded to it. I grew up in a very, I would say, straightforward, conservative, evangelical. Some might label it fundamentalistic. That's a little bit of a complicated thing for me. But very conservative, for sure. Traditional, American, white evangelical. That's what I grew up in. And so the inheritance there, you could probably guess, if you grew up in that, if you know what that probably means about what I thought about hell, I just inherited. And it's odd. I can think of specific times in which I was taught explicitly doctrines of hell, but not that many. Like less than, I can count on one hand the number of times I was taught from a stage about hell explicitly. Although one in particular was fairly, I would say, borderline spiritually traumatizing. I was at a summer camp that I was involved with, but explicit. Yeah, it was pretty intense, that particular talk. But my point is that it was more diffuse in the atmosphere or in the culture. It was more caught than it was taught. But it was this straightforward notion of an eternal conscious torment, being eternally, consciously, knowingly aware and tormented in some place known as hell. That was the destiny. That was what I kind of inherited. What I received was the destiny for those who did not believe in Christ, did not place their faith in Christ, did not pray the prayer, right? Did not have the conversion experience. All those people were destined for an eternal conscious torment afterlife. That's simply put what I received. It was very straightforward, simple kind of doctrine. And I will say I was never given that one experience I just alluded to. That was a little frightening, but otherwise I did not have this ongoing kind of anxiety about hell too much. It came and went at different times in my life, but kind of I want to do this video on there's almost two tracks that you can kind of talk about when you talk about the afterlife. You can talk about the doctrine itself of where does the idea of hell come from, and is that biblically supported or is that philosophically supported, and you can kind of talk about that, and I'm going to talk about that when I get in my questioning. But the other track I want to kind of talk about is the importance of the afterlife in general in Christian thought. And that's those two are in tandem, and they overlap in different key ways. But the thing I want to emphasize, more than just that I inherited this simple, straightforward doctrine of eternal conscious torment, I also inherited a very strong emphasis on the afterlife as being the point of the Christian journey. The afterlife was the goal, and the goal was to be confident and secure in your afterlife destination. It's kind of like the doctrine of hell itself, and then also the importance that was placed on knowing where you were going when you died. That was probably, if anything, that was probably more important than the doctrine of hell in the way I grew up. So there's kind of these multiple layers when you start to peel apart these things that we inherit in kind of spiritual culture. or Christian or church culture. Those are different layers, and I'm going to comment on both because they both affected my journey as I was kind of wrestling with my understanding of hell. But I will say that I didn't grow up like constantly afraid of hell. I did grow up thinking a lot about my afterlife in general, if that makes sense. And so the afterlife, in many ways, it was the point, and therefore getting to heaven was the point, and subsidiary to that was avoiding hell. Was kind of the point. It was the reason we believed what we believed. It was the reason you said the prayer. It was the reason you responded to calls to recommit your life to Jesus. It was the point. It was the point. And I didn't understand how someone could not think it was the point. That was what I inherited. So, eternal conscious torment as kind of a default position of doctrine, but more importantly, this focus on making sure you knew where you were headed after you died, was why you believed what you believed or didn't believe what you didn't believe. So on and so forth. That's my inheritance. That's what I received, and I unthinkingly, largely unquestioningly assented to all of that for my whole childhood, and then it started some tensions. This is me moving into my questioning phase, deconstruction, interrogating phase, kind of the destabilizing phase around all of this. In high school, I believe it was middle of high school, 10th grade-ish, something like that. I started to wonder about some of the implications of these beliefs. Namely, the one thing I remember really questioning was, if it's so important to spread the good news of Christianity, to talk to people about your faith, one thing I started to really question was whether or not fear was actually a very good motive for change in somebody's life. And I started to get uncomfortable with given the assumption that the afterlife was the point, and given the just default assumption of eternal conscious torment as the hell we want to avoid, I started to get uncomfortable with the implication that it seemed like we're really leveraging fear as a tactic, or as kind of this lever to pull to really get people to consider what we believed, we being Christians. I got really uncomfortable with like just the presupposition, I guess you could say, the assumption that fear is going to be the thing that's really going to get people. And it seemed to me that as I was thinking about my own responsibility as a young person in Christianity to talk to people about what I believed and encourage them to think about it, I kind of would default naturally to the afterlife and thinking about avoiding hell, and therefore defaulted to fear. And it just felt off to me. I can't really put any more fine language on it than that. It just felt off. And so that started to erode a little bit of my confidence. On the flip side, there was a flip side version of that too, which I started to wonder about, which furthered my questioning, which was to say, if fear's not a good motive for change in the negative sense, then what's a good motive for change in the positive sense? And then I started to get, and I can't remember exactly when this occurred to me. I think it might have been later in high school into college. Maybe I went to a small Christian college too. I started to question whether the motive of going to heaven when you died, if that was even really just a selfish motive. It was almost this weird inversion of the fear motive, like I want to avoid hell, kind of fear-based motive, but then also I want to go to heaven and as more of a selfish motive. Like I just want to be in the comfortable place. I don't want to be in the bad place, but I kind of want it just for my own comfort, assurance, so that I can kind of live anxiety-free right now. And that actually started to, I don't remember when I started to put my finger on it, but it was somewhere in that late adolescent, young adulthood phase, maybe into college, when I started to get really uncomfortable with even the selfish motive of going to heaven when you died. It all just felt something felt off about this psychological kind of calculus around all of that. So that was really, I bring that up to say that was the beginning of my questioning of some of these inheritances that I had received. And I'm teeing all this up to then tee up the first book that I point to as a kind of watershed book in my journey on all this stuff, which is Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. I read that. So I went through college. I got extraordinarily jaded with evangelical Christianity by the end of my undergrad experience. I went into grad school. I went to a large public state university for my for graduate school. And I entered that phase very disillusioned with any sort of organized Christianity. And I was given that book, Surprised by Hope, right in that phase. And for whatever reason, I read it. I was still kind of shocks me that I agreed to read it at that point. But I did, and that book just kicked open a door in my mind and in my belief and in my whole conception of that one track I mentioned, which was the focus on the afterlife as a goal of Christian ethics and discipleship. That book did more than almost any other book, especially because at that time in my life that I read it, it just ripped open this whole kind of conceptual framework that I had inherited, which is to say, it questioned that entire edifice of the point is the afterlife, the point is your eternal destination. Surprised by Hope, I still think it does a great job. I haven't read it in several years now, but I still think it does a great job at just very straightforwardly questioning all of that and exposing some of the faulty assumptions that go into that line of thinking, and importantly, painting a very compelling and exciting vision of the Christian life as it's to be lived now, and the goal of discipleship and caring for justice in the world, and even our ecological impact on creation. I mean, it just really, N.T. Wright in that book, I think, does a great job at a very accessible level of throwing all that stuff into the air and getting us shaking you out of that stupor of the thing you've inherited, and saying and really appropriately marginalizing this laser focus on just, do you know where you're going to go when you die? I mean, that evangelistic, many of you maybe heard that evangelistic setup, which was, if you died tonight, do you know where you would go? Or if God returned tonight, do you know where you would go? Those kinds of pressure points to try to get you to focus on the afterlife. N.T. Wright just blows through all of that in Surprised by Hope. And that was, I pointed that as a major watershed moment on so many layers of my Christian kind of thinking, but as it relates to the doctrine of hell, that really destabilized the broader conversation about how important, not to say it's not important, but it just needs to be appropriately ordered. It needs to be put in its proper consideration. This focus, this undue heavy focus on where we're, quote unquote, where we're going to go when we die. So Surprised by Hope was a huge shift for me. And then that started to kick open lots of other areas of questioning, which I'll probably refer to Surprised by Hope. And I don't know how many of these videos I'm going to do under my journey, but that book was such a hinge point for me. It'll probably come up more. But now what I want to do is I want to move into some more of the questions that, as a result of that watershed moment, I want to move into some other questions I started to ask and started to explore. Because then I did start to explore, okay, well, if the afterlife is not the end-all be-all, the only thing we should be focused on, what should we focus on? And then what do we do with the afterlife? How do you kind of appropriately consider eternal destiny? And what does that look like? What does that mean? And those are the questions I started to ask actively as it relates to both heaven and hell, but I'll focus on hell in this video. So then I read, many of you will remember the Love Wins controversy around Rob Bell. I was a major Rob Bell fan. I haven't followed him in years now, but I stayed a follower of his for quite a long time. Read most of his books, and I read Love Wins in the wake of that huge controversy. If you remember John Piper tweeting about it, dismissing him, and it's his platform in many ways within evangelicalism, it blew up, and not in a good way, blew up in a bad way after Love Wins came out. And I read it, and I liked it, and I put the book down, and I honestly put it down with a little bit of a shrug, because I was expecting this time bomb, and I put it down, and I thought that was a really, it was a Rob Bell book. It's extraordinarily easy to read. It's very conversational, and my honest reaction to putting down Love Wins was, he just asked a lot of really interesting and provocative questions in that book, but he didn't pose, in my reading of it, and I've read it a few times, he didn't pose a full-throated refutation of eternal conscious torment, nor a full-throated case for Christian universalism. He just asks a lot of destabilizing questions in that book that kind of get at some of these invisible assumptions a lot of evangelicals carry about hell and heaven. And so I put down the book, and I thought, and I kind of scratched my head, and I thought, it's really interesting that this lit such a lightning rod, because the book itself is not that much of a lightning rod book. And then that caused me to start to ask, wow, why are certain evangelicals so defensive of a certain strict and rigid understanding of hell? Why are they so defensive that a book like Love Wins is so threatening when it is in itself not a very forceful book or a forceful argument? And so that started to kick up a lot more questions for me, kind of observing evangelical culture and tradition. And then I started to think, well, I wonder if there's such a urge to protect this one strict understanding of hell, what are some other understandings of hell? Like, what other understandings exist out there? Like, Love Wins was kind of a little bit of a springboard to kind of explore, which I guess as I'm saying that, maybe that's precisely why people like John Piper were concerned about it. They didn't want people exploring other ideas. I don't know. But there's kind of one of those ironic things about, like, the more you try to suppress something, the more it pops out and has actually more influence on the other side of it, which is, I think, precisely what happened with Love Wins. But regardless, that's a tangent. In my experience, I read it and it springboarded me into exploring some of these other areas. And so I literally had never heard, for example, I had never heard of the doctrine of annihilation, or what some will call conditional immortality. I had never even heard of that doctrine or that tradition at all until after I read Love Wins and I started to intentionally look into other understandings of hell. I never heard of it, which in hindsight for me is really shocking, because the doctrine of annihilation is very well represented in prominent Christian thinking. Someone as straight-line conservative as John Stott was a remarkably vocal explicator of the doctrine of annihilation, which is to say, if you haven't heard of it or aren't familiar with it, the doctrine of annihilation is this idea that humans who persist in unbelief or non-repentance especially will eventually cease to exist entirely, will go out of existence whole cloth. They will be quote-unquote annihilated. That's a little bit of an intense term, but they will no longer exist. They will not be eternally and consciously tormented. So that's the important distinction there. The conditional immortality language is someone like Preston Sprinkle, who is also a defender of annihilation, will say that conditional immortality is a better way to talk about it, because the idea there philosophically is that it's never assumed that humans have immortal souls. This is why in Genesis, so this is the biblical defense of it, in Genesis, the Adam and Eve were kept away from the tree of life because it would not be good for them to access the tree of life and therefore access immortality in their sinful state. And so they're kept away from the tree of life for that reason. But that implies that humans are not de facto immortal, right? The soul is not an immortal thing. And so conditional immortality would say that God chooses who to preserve through eternity in an immortal fashion and chooses who to let go into an annihilation or a non-existence. So there's a lot of representatives of that kind of way of thinking about the afterlife. Fudge's book, I think it's Edward Fudge, The Fire That Consumes, is kind of the pinnacle in terms of academic biblical studies, like exploration of the doctrine of annihilation in the biblical canon. There's all kinds of representatives of this view. I've never even heard of it. I had never even heard of it until after I read Love Wins and I started exploring. That just blew my mind. And then I learned, kind of circling back around to N.T. Wright, I learned that N.T. Wright is someone who at least tips his hand to, I don't know if he would come right out and say he's an annihilationist, but he tips his hand very much to that way of thinking. He's speculated that it's very possible that people who persist in unrepentance will lapse back into a kind of a non-human state. They will have the very image of God. They will no longer bear the image of God, and they will kind of lapse into a non-being kind of thing, which is very much within at least the broad umbrella of annihilationism. So I learned a lot about that doctrine, and then I learned about some of the implications. The conditional immortality thing was helpful for me because I learned that, as someone like Preston Sprinkle would argue, and others would say, that to assume the immortality of the soul is to assume a Platonic understanding of anthropology and a metaphysical kind of Platonic doctrine of the soul, of the human soul, and it's not actually to assume a biblical doctrine of or a Judeo doctrine of the soul. It's more of to smuggle in a Hellenistic or Greek or Platonic idea of the soul. So all these things started to kind of come to the surface for me, and it was really, really mind-blowing and extremely helpful to start to complicate some of these traditions. And then I discovered Universalism. So many of you are going to be wondering where I land on all this stuff. I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to just explicate a little bit of Universalism as I understand it. So I grew up with this eternal conscious torment. I learned about this represented tradition of or understanding and doctrine of annihilation. Then I learned about this, what actually has some surprising historic precedent, this doctrine of Christian universalism or ultimate reconciliation. Apokatastasis is the Greek term, and that is actually a biblical term that comes out of a sermon that Peter gives in the book of Acts when he talks about all things being fulfilled. Apokatastasis, I think is how you pronounce that. So right now, I mean, as I'm recording this in 2024, David Bentley Hart is one of the preeminent and also most controversial defenders of Christian Universalism. His book, That All Shall Be Saved, I've actually reviewed on this channel. It's a book, I love David Bentley Hart. I love David Bentley Hart in general, and I liked that book quite a bit. It's not my favorite of his by any means, but I liked it. But he is a very forceful defender of a Christian Universalism. Someone like a Robin Parry, who wrote the Evangelical Universalist under a pseudonym initially because it was too controversial to talk about at the time. He wrote it on the pseudonym Gregory Macdonald, I believe, which was a nod to Gregory of Nyssa, a church father who is believed to potentially be a Universalist. But then also George Macdonald, Scottish writer and theologian, who also was, if he wasn't explicitly a Universalist, he was like as close as you could be to one. So he combined those into that pseudonym and wrote this book, The Evangelical Universalist, defending universalism from an evangelical kind of ethos or evangelical biblical exegetical perspective. So, and there's so many more that could be discussed. There's I'll talk a little bit about von Balthasar in a minute, but there's also a Catholic tradition by represented by someone like Hans Urs von Balthasar, which would be more of a softer or a more hopeful universalistic perspective, hoping for the ultimate redemption of all things. But this, if I can just define this Christian, I think that of all the ones that have maybe the most popular misunderstandings around them, it's the Christian Universalist one. Is a lot of very just like surface level misunderstandings about what it actually is and what it's actually talking about, what it's actually representing. And the idea is simply that at the end of all things, in the ultimate eschaton, the ultimate fulfillment of all of God's purposes in eternity, those who represent apokatastasis or Christian Universalism would say that all people are reconciled to God at the end of all things, in the fulfillment of all things. Now, importantly, the thoughtful explicators of this doctrine will not put any sort of time limits or like overly certain mechanisms as to how that all works. They just assert that it is the end of all things. And so some like the book Holy Hell that I reviewed, for example, by Derek Kubilus, or someone like Robin Parry or whatever, they would say they would leave a lot of room for mystery in a sort of intermediate state afterlife condition that might be purgatorial, like the Catholic doctrine of purgatory and cleansing and refining after an earthly life. They will leave a lot of room for God to be working in someone's life and bringing them closer and closer and closer to Him and to reconciliation with God. And it potentially might take a long time. It could potentially be a torturous experience. So in a weird way, many of the Christian Universalists would affirm or at least leave open space for some kind of torturous afterlife, close to what conservative evangelicals would call hell. They would leave room for that, but they would just not they would assert that at the end, ultimately, after some epoch of time, some undefined mystery, some ultimate zoomed out look at eternity, at the end of it all, when God's purposes are fully unveiled and revealed and completed, they would say that all people will be saved and reconciled to their Creator. And they would do that confidently and with conviction. That is the doctrine of apokatastasis, that it comes around to that at the end of all things. So I discovered that was the last kind of like, and I think it's fair to say that in the landscape of Christian tradition and teaching on hell, those are probably, broadly speaking, the three main doctrines. There's this eternal conscious torment tradition. There is this tradition of annihilation, non-being, and then there is this ultimate reconciliation or universalism tradition that all exist to various tension points. They all exist within the very broad umbrella of Christian teaching. Some would argue how much the universalism one really would be small o orthodox or not, but they all certainly exist, and there's precedent for all of them in the writings of the Church Fathers, for example. I mean, people point to Gregory of Nyssa as a representative of the Universalist perspective. Many would point to Origen, although that's complicated. I'll get to that in a second. People would point to Tertullian. I believe he was the one who talked about, or Aquinas as well, talked about being able to observe the torturings of those who are damned in the afterlife. So they would point to those writings as examples of the eternal conscious torment. So all I'm trying to say is that there's representation in ancient writings in the Christian in Christian teaching for all this stuff. And the point I'm trying to say is that I discovered all of this. It was like this, like floodgates burst open. I discovered all these ways of thinking that I just had no idea existed through pretty much my entire childhood, adolescence, even through college, my undergraduate experience at a Christian school. Was not really exposed to all this stuff, and so it just like threw open the doors of my mind to realize that there was all of this wealth of thinking and writing and biblical exegesis and philosophical reflection on the afterlife and the soul, and all of the stuff within the broad Christian tradition. So I was asking questions and discovering all that, exploring all of that. And it started to tee up questions for me. Like, I'm still in this middle phase, this messy middle phase of like exploring, deconstructing, interrogating. Questions like, what does it mean to say that God is good and just and merciful and loving? Some of the questions that exploring annihilation resolves some tensions for me. I think the tension of the idea of God preserving, especially when I started to learn more about the Platonic doctrines of the soul and conditional immortality, the question or the idea that God would intentionally preserve human souls in eternity for the purpose of kind of keeping them sequestered in this torturous state with absolutely no open door for them to ever repent or change, but that's just where they would exist. That started to get extraordinarily tense for me to keep that possibility in my mind that God would do that. I'm not negating the possibility of that, and there's certain thoughtful explicators of that very thing that exist in Christian doctrine today. But that got really difficult. It got really, really hard for me to figure out the defense for that, even the defense for that biblically. And so then the annihilation doctrine started to resolve some of those very tensions for me. And importantly, I think that annihilation has very, very strong biblical support. I'll say more about that in my conclusion in a minute. But some of the idea of this non-being, this release of the soul into non-existence, it does resolve some of those tensions of the eternal conscious torment kind of assumptions that get brought to bear. But then the overarching question of what would it mean for God to be good, and what does God's ultimate purposes look like at the end of all things? And importantly, a question that I started to ask in the face of all of this was the big zoomed out story question, and as it's presented in Romans chapter 5, that dichotomy between the fall and sin of Adam and then the victory of Jesus as the second Adam. Those things are put in juxtaposition to each other in Romans chapter 5, and it starts to really get at the question of which action was more powerful, the fall of Adam or the victory of Christ, right? The action of Adam, which allowed sin, evil, and death into the world, or the victory of Christ, which overthrew the power of sin, evil, and death in our world. Which one of those was more powerful? And when I faced that question and kind of exploring this whole landscape of thinking, when I honestly faced that question, I realized that the inheritance I had been given said, functionally, they never explicitly said this, but functionally they said, well, the sin of Adam was greater than the victory of Christ. Just like statistically, numerically, that one of them results in affecting way more people than the other one. And I can hear all the pushbacks to all of that, but that was when I got confronted with that in a kind of a blazing way, no pun intended. I realized that there was something that I needed to do. At minimum, I needed to really explore there, because it was hard for me to countenance the idea that Christ's victory was paltry compared to the action of Adam, which consigned untold numerous other people to an eternal condemnation and eternal punishment. That something felt concerning about that. And so other questions that come up when you really honestly explore these doctrines are some of the Universalists give really, really, really good defenses or provocative kind of challenges to some assumptions we have. So I'll lay out a couple of them. One that I think Dave Bentley Hart does a really good job at in his book, which doesn't tend to get a lot of, in my view, a lot of the debates around this stuff focus on like biblical references or kind of historical writings in the Church Fathers. But there is this philosophical question that I think is really important for people to wrestle with, that I think Dave Bentley Hart brings out really well in his book, That All Shall Be Saved, that I wish more people paid attention to this aspect of the argument, which is to say our interconnectedness as humans. And so we are all, our identities and our sense of self and our sense of who we are inevitably bleed into each other, and who I am is very much in relation to my spouse and my kids and my family and my friends. And so we're all deeply interconnected in that way, in that sense of who we are. And that starts to have implications for when we think about the redemption of all things in the afterlife. Because if you quote unquote go to heaven, but people you're deeply connected with who have some bearing on who you are not in heaven or are consigned to an eternal punishment, that starts to get really, really troubling. The implications that get really troubling, and it starts to bring up questions about, well, if I'm sent to heaven or blessed to go to heaven, then what about all these people that I'm deeply connected with, that love me, and who are in some sense part of me, and I am part of them? How can they not also be included? And then if you extrapolate that out to all of humanity, that starts to look pretty universal at the end of the day. That's just I think that's a really worthwhile philosophical, anthropological kind of question that a lot of people I don't think wrestle with as much as at least that I've seen. And then one more that I'll get to, and then I'll move on to kind of the last phase of my video here. Another question maybe two more. Another question is the philosophical question of equivocity, which is to say, when we use a word like good or loving or redemption, that must have some correspondence. And I'm getting into linguistic theory and philosophical theory, and I know I'm going to get way over my skis here in a second, but I'm just kind of putting out this challenge and this question that I've seen presented to me, and I think it's a very good question, which is to say, when we use those words, they must correspond to some actual real meaning that must be affirmed by our moral intuitions, or else, so for example, those who would just maybe simplistically defend an eternal conscious torment with a massive reprobate, like the certain highly Calvinistic strands would say, like, the mass of human history is actually reprobate and a small elect are consigned to eternal bliss in heaven. They would affirm that and say that's exactly what Christ what God in His sovereignty has ordained, and they would say, and that is good. That's good because that is what God has willed, and so therefore it is good. It's kind of a tautological definition of good there. It's good because God said it's good, so therefore it's good. But their actual meaning of that, the meaning they load into that is to say it's good, is by any and all accounts on our experiential level as humans is bad. To say that the mass of humanity that's been created by God is actually consigned to some eternal state of torture, and that is good. The problem of equivocity starts to say, well, you're using the word good to describe something that is by any other definition not good, and therefore the word good starts to lose any meaning. It starts to lose any grip on reality, any traction, any linguistic traction on what we actually mean when we say the word good. And once you start to break the links between the words and what the words mean, then we kind of lose the possibility of talking about anything at that point. That's another really important question that I think needs to be wrestled with, honestly, in the question of the afterlife. And then the last question I want to ask, that this middle section has gotten a lot longer. I know that these videos get longer than I mean to, but the last thing I want to pose that the Universalists pose to people who think about these issues that I think is really good to wrestle with is the question of freedom and free choice, because that is a typical clapback that you will get if someone affirms a universalism. The rejoinder they'll get is to say, well, I'm not a universalist because I believe that God preserves our freedom to choose, and God would preserve our freedom to choose even if it means our freedom to choose away from Him in an eternal state, that God is that committed to our ability to choose that God will preserve our ability to choose away from Him in perpetuity, even unto eternity. That's an argument that will come up. And at first blush, that makes a lot of sense, and at first blush, that can be kind of the end of the conversation. Thoughtful universalists, though, have a very good response to that, which is to question the presuppositions of what we mean by freedom itself. And so someone like David Bentley Hart will say, freedom must mean, in the Christian tradition, it must mean freedom to be aligned with God, freedom to be aligned with our Creator's purposes for us as a being. Freedom must mean freedom from anything that clouds us or blinds our judgment, so freedom must mean freedom from sin, ultimately. And if you are ultimately freed from sin in that sense, it would be impossible to imagine someone being truly free from sin, truly free from anything that would cloud their judgment away from the goodness of God and the mercy and the love of God. And at that point, would they still choose away from God if they are actually truly free in that more Christian historical sense than the modern libertarian sense of freedom of choice? Like, for us in our culture, freedom means we can choose. At any given point, you cannot constrict my ability to choose for or away from something. That's how we define freedom. But the deeper, richer Christian tradition will define freedom in that way I just presented, which is to say freedom away from sin, freedom away from things that cloud our judgment, freedom ultimately to be more in line with our purposes as created by God, which then would ultimately imply that ultimate freedom would bring us into alignment with God, which would mean we would be with God in the future. That's another really good rejoinder, I think, that Universalists have to some of these arguments that people bring up. Okay. So, that was a long kind of a blitzing tour through different doctrines of hell, through all the things that I started to learn, all the things that I started to explore. And now what I want to do is I want to move into this last phase of my video, and I want to present where I'm at now on all of this. You may have just heard me list off all those challenges from Universalists and be thinking, oh, this guy must be a Christian Universalist. And I'm going to give a complicated answer to that. Where I squarely put myself right now, well, okay, before I say where I squarely put myself, let me just lay out. I think that there's at least three factors to consider to bring into conversation with each other when you try to land on your doctrine of hell or the afterlife. One is the biblical account. If you're, especially I'm a Protestant, so I can't wriggle around the biblical account. What does the Bible present as the destiny of humans? Then I think the second thing I would offer is philosophical reflection. What does philosophical reflection tell us? And some of those challenges I just gave from the biblical or the Christian Universalist quarter put those very sharply and in very challenging, provocative ways. It's important. So we can't ignore philosophical reflection. It's not possible, I don't think. And then the third thing I would add is I do think there is a really important place for tradition and Christian teaching over history. And when you take all those things into account, my very summary presentation is that I think the biblical canon presents I think if you just try as much as possible to set aside presuppositions and traditional kind of like things you may have been told to think about what the Bible says, I think a pretty straightforward reading of the Bible leads one to an annihilation doctrine, honestly. I think that is pretty fair to say. There are a couple things that do lean into a more of an eternal conscious torment, couple references, but it's really actually not as many as you'd think. It's a couple, literally less than 5. And even those have really intelligent questions about the language that's being used and the context in which they're being talked. Like there's one in Revelation, there's a couple in Jesus' parables. There's really good questions about those few that would really complicate the simplistic assertion of an eternal conscious torment directly from the Bible. I think on the second one, philosophical reflection, I think lends itself towards an ultimate reconciliation and ultimate universalism perspective. Some of those challenges that I just laid out about freedom, about the interconnectedness of humanity, about the question of what is good and what does loving mean, the purposes of God, I think pretty careful philosophical reflection does start to lean one in that direction. I think that's where I put David Bentley Hart squarely in that. I think he's a philosopher first and foremost, more than a biblical exegete, and I think that that's part of why he's such a confident defender of a Christian Universalist perspective. And then there's the question of tradition. What does tradition defend? Well, I think there's a good argument to me that the weight of tradition is on more of an eternal conscious punishment, condemnation. There's also a surprising representation of Christian Universalism within Christian tradition, however. And I will caveat that by saying that I know some of the arguments against people like Origen, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, condemning the doctrine of apokatastasis is what it seems like what happened there. I know that that's all there. I know there's some tensions around that, but nevertheless, I think it's hard to ignore that there are certain Christian teachers that at least seem to leave the door open towards a universalistic approach towards the future, like Gregory of Nyssa or Macdonald, as I talked about a minute ago, more recently. So those are the facts. So when I look at all this, I look at everything that I've been through and I have explored. And I look at those 3 dimensions, the Bible, philosophy, tradition, where I put myself and where I've reconstructed a new doctrine of hell for myself, best of my understanding right now. I would put myself squarely in what I call a hopeful universalism. And that's a really important distinction for me. I am not, and I will explain why as I close this video, I am not a full-throated, uber-confident defender of a Christian universalism like a David Bentley Hart is. I'm not there for some key reasons. But I maintain an openness and a hopefulness in God's ultimate restoring of all things. That I maintain a hope that that is possible and that might be God's intention at the end of history, so to speak, the end of time. And so I had a seminary professor say once, and this just like stuck. It kind of became burrowed into my cerebellum. She said, "I am not a universalist, but I hope that God is." And I don't know if she was quoting someone else or what, but that struck me and has stuck with me ever since, all the years since I have been in seminary. And that's really squarely where I'm at. I am not someone who can stand in front and explicate with certainty that I know for sure that God is going to restore all things and that is the ultimate destiny of all people, but I maintain a wide hope that might in fact be what eternal destiny is. And let me end by saying this is why I land there. This is going to weirdly connect to my atonement video. And if you watch my atonement video, you may not be expecting that. But let me make the connection here. And the reason I'm not over the threshold of being a confident universalist or a certain universalist. I would say certain is probably a better descriptor there. David Bentley Hart is certain for sure. That's why some people don't like him. But when I talked to my atonement video about one of the reasons I got pushed away from the inheritance of atonement, the penal substitution, kind of simple penal substitution atonement that I had been taught, one of the things I talked about was that I realized at some level there was this hidden invisible assumption that, and you can watch that video if you're not tracking with what I'm talking about right now, but there was this hidden assumption in certain ways of talking about atonement that there was this metaphysical thing out there called justice that seemed to be functionally stronger than God, in that God had to obey justice and appease justice by acting in a certain way to merit out the punishment that was the just punishment due to humanity. And the implications of that got really troubling to me, is to say, well, if there's this thing that's stronger than God that's called justice, then who is God that we are worshiping, and why aren't we worshiping justice instead of God? The point is that there was this thing, this conviction on a human level that certain people were teaching, that there was this thing that God had to do. And that's the key phrase, that there was this idea that God absolutely had to act in a certain way, or that God would be, I don't know, compromising God's own nature or something like that, in this case around the theme of justice. So you can watch my atonement video for me unpacking that a little bit more. There's weirdly something similar going on in certain strands of talking about the afterlife, and I see it prop up in Christian universalism sometimes, which is to say that, given all my caveats about equivocity and the philosophical linguistic stuff going on there that I think is worth reflecting on and thinking about, there's still this question for me that sometimes the way people present it, and this can happen in universalist circles, it can also happen in eternal conscious torment circles, it can happen it can crop up in any mode of reflection, but it's to use that same logic that God must act in a certain way or God is not God, on my terms and my own human conceptions of it. So in the case of universalism, some will say that in order for God to be good, God must save everybody. In order for the word good to mean anything related to God, then that God must do this. And I get the logic there, I really do, but I get very wary and very nervous about any logic that results in God must act in this way, from my perspective, as a human reflecting on God, as a human doing theology. If my theology leads me, in whatever form it is, to say God must do this, I really start to wonder, are we still talking about God at that point? Because it seems to me that if God is God, and this is where the discovery of classical reflection upon the nature of God has been extraordinarily helpful for me. If God is God, then God is God, and there's nothing outside of God constraining or forcing God to act in any way. And so for me, it's not so much that I find the conclusions of universalists like off the table, or even, I think there's even, I struggle personally. I'm pretty far away from an eternal conscious torment perspective at these days myself, but there are thoughtful people who would not commit these same logical errors or theological errors that I'm talking about now that would maybe defend that. And I think there's room for that. But for me, I'm very nervous about anything that results in that overly certain language about how God must act. And the classical doctrine of God, the discovery of that, which I might do another video on that at some point, for me has really brought me back to this pretty simple conclusion that God must be God, and God is not a being within being, but God is the very being itself. God is the sustainer of all things. God is simple. God is divine. And God, if God is God, then God must be God, and therefore God must not be constrained. Otherwise, God will not be God, and the thing that's constraining God would then actually have to be God. And I know that gets extremely head spinning if you really reflect on it, but I think that's kind of the point. I think it's the point of theology, is to enter into the deeper mystery. This is the apophatic tradition of theology, is to enter into the deeper mystery and to actually confess the limits of our understanding of God, which do exist at some point. And it seems to me that overly certain prescriptions for how God must act exceed the limits of that apophatic tradition in a way that I think is very concerning. And so that's why I'm not a full-throated certain universalist, but I maintain a hopeful posture towards the possibility of it. And I think it's represented well in deep Christian reflection over the centuries. I think it's very, very possible. It's very possible that all people will be reconciled when all things are fulfilled. I hope that that's true. I think we should all hope that that's true. But I maintain an open-handed posture towards God being God, God not being constrained by any of my conceptions of how God must act, and ultimately a wideness in God's mercy, to use Clark Pinnock's phrase. And so that's me. That's my journey through hell into a hopeful, open-handed, hopefully open-minded, hopefully intellectually humble posture of what I would call a hopeful, universalistic look towards the future of all things. I hope this was helpful to you. I hope that my journey resonated with you as you're watching this. I hope that maybe it gave you some resources to look into or some language to put to your own journey. If anything resonated with you, if this brings up questions for you or thoughts or other things you'd like me to explore that relate to this, I would love to hear about any of that. Ultimately, I'm hoping that these videos are helpful resources for people who are on their own spiritual journeys, who are all over the place. So yeah, those are my reflections. As always, thank you so much for taking some time to watch.